Thank you, Karen, and I hope the handout is going round. I hope everybody has Professor Aston's handout. While you're getting ready, I'll just say that I hope to do justice to the speech. I don't know if you know Guy Aston personally. He's a very tall and a very handsome man, so if you could all just please use your imagination for a moment, half close your eyes and relax, and when you're ready, I'll deliver his speech. Interpreter corpora and interpreter training. In this paper, I want to argue that electronic corpora of interpreting data can be a useful tool in the training of interpreters. I'm not the first person to say this, particularly as far as concerns terminology. For example, Annalisa Sandrelli, in a paper listed in the references on the back of your handout, notes this as a possible use of the EPIC corpus, constructed by my colleagues at the University of Bologna, and described in another paper by Bendazzoli and Sandrelli. But here I want to emphasize one particular feature of interpreter talk, that is the use of multi-word expressions, or formulae, as they're sometimes called. Many linguists have stressed that speakers do not, on the whole, produce language one word at a time. Instead, they produce it phrase by phrase. They use memorized chunks of language, each of which consists of several words. Those of you who are familiar with corpus linguistics will know John Sinclair's idiom principle. Sinclair argues that a language user has available to him or her a large number of semi-preconstructed phrases that constitute single choices, even though they might appear to be analyzable into segments. These semi-preconstructed phrases I shall term formulae. Using formulae reduces the need to combine smaller units, like single words or morphemes, and this means less effort for the speaker. Research has shown that speakers rely strongly on formulae in situations which are particularly demanding, either from a cognitive or an affective point of view. Examples include auctioneering, sports commentaries, political interviews, and oral examinations. Here, I want to follow up a suggestion by Henriksen that a further example is simultaneous interpreting. We all know interpreting is a very demanding activity, as depicted by Daniel Gilles' effort model, and I want to argue that corpora can help trainee interpreters to acquire appropriate formulae which can help to reduce the effort involved. In his book, Conference Interpreting Examined, Roderick Jones stressed the importance for interpreters of acquiring multi-word formulae. Long before him, in a short paper in Meta, Gérard Ilg attempted to list some French formulae which he thought were particularly useful for interpreters, such as poser une question, susciter des réponses, aborder le problème. But these lists were based on their author's intuition and personal experience. Corpora allow us, and learners who know how to exploit them, to identify such formulae in practice. In this paper, I shall look at some of the formulae used by interpreters in the English booth at the European Parliament. My corpus is a small one, about 60,000 words. It consists of the output of the English booth on the 22nd of April 2009, which I transcribed from the recordings which are available on the European Parliament site. Glancing casually at this corpus, it is relatively easy for a teacher, and I would argue for learners who've been sensitized to look out for them, to identify things that appear to be formulae. Take the extract in number 1 on your handout. During the course of this Parliament, when we've been looking at public transport, there were 2 issues on the agenda. The first one concerned public authorities. What are they doing in this area of public contracts? Now, in my political group, we opted for freedom of choice. When we're talking about coach or bus transport, we have to make sure there's no distortion, if you like, of our transport policy. Here, there are many expressions that might be seen as formulae, listed under number 2 on your handout. Some of them can obviously be varied slightly. In the words of Sinclair, they seem to be semi-preconstructed units. During the course of something, we've been looking at something, public transport, there are or were a number of issues on the agenda, the first or second or last one concerned something, what are they doing in this area of something, public contracts, in my or our or their political group, we are opting or opted for something, freedom of choice, when we're talking about something, coach or bus transport, we have to make sure that something, there's no distortion of something, if you like, our or their transport policy. Some of these expressions are clearly terms that relate to the specific topic: public transport, public authorities, public contracts, coach or bus transport, our or their transport policy. But the majority seem more general in their application. One interesting case is if you like, which serves to mark an adjacent formula as providing only an approximate rendition, surely an extraordinarily useful hedging device for an interpreter. The slots indicated in capital letters on your handout would allow many of these formulae to be used with terms related to different topics or to be used with different tenses and agents. But this analysis is still purely intuitive. We need more quantitative analysis in order to identify those formulae which effectively play an important part in these interpreters' repertoire. The first approach is to look for recurrent sequences and combinations of words. For example, using the cluster function of Mike Scott's software Wordsmith tools, or the n-gram function of Lawrence Anthony's AntConc, we can obtain a list of all the phrases which are at least 5 words long and which occur at least 5 times in the corpus. This list is number 3 on your handout. If you glance quickly down this list, you will see that many of these phrases are specific to the Parliament and its conventions. Voting procedures, for instance. It's a roll call vote, and the vote is open. We need a qualified majority. Changes in topic, we move on to the report by, that brings us on to the report by. Turn assignments by the President, I'd like or I would like to give the floor to, has the floor for 2 minutes. Turn taking and acknowledgement, thank you very much, President, Madam President. Many of these phrases would appear to form part of longer formulae with slots to be filled by variables, often, but not always, names. Thank you very much, Mr. X, the report by X, X has the floor for 2 minutes. When it comes to the X, I think we need to X, X need, have to make sure that X. The nature of these variables and other contextual constraints can be checked by generating concordances of the phrases in question. Thus, number 4 on your handout shows 11 occurrences of the phrase on to the report by. Here you can see that there are 2 alternative expressions which precede on to the report by, namely, that brings us and we move. You can also see that the slot following by is usually filled by Mr. Name or Mrs. Name. Overall, we seem to have 2 longer recurrent formulae which appear synonymous, namely, we move on to the report by Mr. or Mrs. X, and that brings us on to the report by Mr. or Mrs. X. Another thing this concordance shows us is that in many cases, these formulae are preceded by congratulations to a previous rapporteur. If we generate a concordance of the word congratulations, we find that the President's congratulations are generally used to close a vote on a previous report prior to introducing the next one. We now have a clear indication of the situation in which the 2 formulae we've identified are typically used. But perhaps the most interesting phrases in the list in number 3 on your handout are ones which do not seem associated with particular parliamentary procedures, but seem potentially applicable to a wider range of situations. These include phrases like, I think we need to come up with we need to ensure that when it comes to take the last of these, when it comes to if we generate a concordance of when it, closely followed by a form of come, we can see whether this formula allows variation of tense and aspect, can involve other prepositions, or indeed allows negation. You can see the outcome in number 5 on your handout. In this concordance, we can see that the lemma come is always followed by to, that we find the past tense came as well as the present come, but that there are no cases of the progressive is coming or was coming, nor are there any with the negative when it doesn't come to or when it comes not to. The objects of come to are semantically generic ones and hence often without the definite article, and the formula is quite often preceded by especially. In comparison, there are no occurrences with particularly. On this basis, we might want to say that when it comes to X, and especially when it comes to X, are both formulae worth learning for the trainee interpreter. Let us move on to another example from our list, namely, we need to ensure that. This concordance is number 6 on your handout. One question which arises here concerns the use of that. Is this element optional or obligatory? By generating a concordance for the word ensure and sorting it by the following words, we find that where a subordinate clause follows, it is always introduced by that. Where we instead find variety is in the modalization preceding ensure that. As well as need to, we also find can, be able to, and want to. Need to is, however, quite the most common, and we need to ensure that something thus seems the most useful formula for the trainee to take away from this analysis. Another question which might be posed is whether, as well as ensure, other verbs can be used following we need to, and whether these have a similar function. If we generate a concordance of we need to, we find that one frequent alternative is we need to make sure that. See number 7 on your handout. This appears to be synonymous with we need to ensure that. Again, it's interesting to note that the word that appears to be a standard element in the formula, even if it is not obligatory from a strictly grammatical point of view. Clearly, the methodology I have illustrated here has limits. First, focusing simply on recurrent sequences of words, like those in number 3 on your handout, does not necessarily capture every formula, since the latter may include a wide range of slots and variants. But it does provide a starting point. Second, using a corpus which consists of transcripts, as I've done here, ignores one fundamental aspect of formulae, namely their prosodic features. Recent work by Phoebe Lynn has demonstrated that as well as having canonical lexicogrammatical forms, formulae also have canonical prosodies, default patterns of stress and intonation. These two need to be learned by trainees. For this purpose, they really need corpora where transcripts are aligned with the audio, so that when you generate a concordance, you can not only see and read the relevant extracts from the transcripts, but also hear the relevant extracts from the interpreter's speech. In this way, the professional interpreter's work can provide the trainee with a model which they can listen to and whose prosody they can attempt to imitate. But unfortunately, aligned interpreting corpora of this kind do not yet exist, as far as I know. You can get an idea of what they might be like by looking at Hazibi's corpus of TED lectures, which can be consulted on the internet. This enables you to concordance the transcripts and hear the corresponding audio chunks. But these, of course, are all original lectures, not the output of interpreters. Enough is enough. I hope, in this short presentation, that I've given you an idea of how a corpus of interpreting data can reveal formulae which may be useful to the trainee. The corpus we've been looking at is very small, but it can still, I think, provide a means to sensitize trainees to the importance of formulae, helping them to notice and to analyze them. Once they learn to use concordancing software and are given access to larger corpora, this is something that learners can do for themselves, discovering formulae for themselves. In the context of a conference in Greece, I must close by referring again to the paper by Henriksson, who compares the simultaneous interpreter to the epic poet. Homer's poetry, she notes, makes extensive use of recurrent multi-word formulae. The interpreter, she argues, must do the same thing in order to produce what she terms the song in the booth. Thank you for your attention, and I send my sincere apologies for my absence. I will be happy to try and answer any questions or comments by email.